Hey guys, I'm Shreya, and today we're going to be covering the AP Human topic of territory, boundaries, and governance. Remember to follow Fiveable at Think Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube to be notified and updated of all the events happening. In this stream, we will be covering mostly the topics of territoriality, boundaries, governments, state shapes, and then at the end, we'll be concluding with 3 multiple choice questions and an FRQ. So first, I want you guys to rate yourself on the following vocabulary terms, and please be honest so I can know which areas I need to focus on the most during the stream, and rate yourself from 1 to 5 in the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing some 3s and 4s, but I'm also seeing some 1s, which is completely fine. We're going to be covering these topics in depth, so you guys will be more comfortable by the end of the stream. Thank you for the feedback. First, we're going to be covering territoriality theories. So territoriality is basically when an individual or a group influences or controls people and their connections by asserting power over a territory. And the concept of territoriality is connected to culture, and it can contribute to conflict between cultures or ethnic groups. So you can see the concept of territoriality almost everywhere when people fight over land or countries clash, when ethnic groups mix and they don't get along, and that causes conflict as well. And economic tension can also result when resources are involved. So if 2 countries are fighting over the same piece of land because of it having a certain resource, that can also cause some tension between 2 states. So first, the organic theory by Frederick Ratzel. He said that states had to grow to survive or else other states would take over. And Ratzel basically made an analogy between states and living organisms. And he just thought that if you didn't grow your territory or expand, you wouldn't exist and other states would take over. The Heartland Theory by Sir Halford Mackinder stated that land-based power was important to dominate the world. And Mackinder believed that the heartland, and you can see this orange area on the map, is the heartland, and that consists of Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia. And Mackinder said that the heartland would rule and that land-based power was a lot more important than naval power. And everything else on this map is called Rimland, or in this yellow area, and then periphery, which is this gray area. And Mackinder strongly believed in land-based power because since the heartland is landlocked and it's not surrounded by that much open water, it's really hard to attack because you have to enter through Eastern Europe and it's hard to enter through there. Also, land transportation like railroads were faster at that time than sea-based transport like ships and boats. So he also thought that that was an important factor contributing to the heartland's success. And he also said that a majority of the population existed in the heartland. So the Rimland Theory by Nicholas Spikeman, he said that power is derived by having control over specific maritime areas. And as you can see on the map, the Rimland is the densely populated coastal area surrounding the heartland. And Spikeman believed in the Rimland Theory because the Rimland has more access to various resources, and he placed a lot more value on sea power because obviously you have a lot more ports for trading and it's easier to travel out and explore to other countries. So these are the types of boundaries. I know there's a lot, but after you learn all of them, you can probably start figuring them out by just context clues. So a natural boundary is a political boundary based on physical features to separate 2 entities. And an example of this is the Himalayan mountains separating India and China, and that creates a natural barrier between the 2 countries. A geometric boundary is a political boundary that is defined and delimited by a straight line, and we will be covering the definitions of delimited and defined later. But basically, an example of this is the straight lines between the states in the United States called Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. So when you look at these states on a map, you can see that it makes a perfect 4 right angles. And obviously, this isn't natural. Like someone drew this on a map, and it wasn't like made because of a natural feature or anything. Next, an antecedent boundary is a boundary drawn before the cultural landscape emerged. And a common example of this would be the boundary between the United States and Canada, which was made across the 49th parallel. So what happened was that people drew the boundary between the United States and Canada, and the cultural groups developed because of the boundary. And they developed after the boundary was made, so there was no reason for that boundary to be made only because like they were just trying to separate the two countries. A subsequent or ethnographic boundary is a boundary which accounts for religious, ethnic, linguistic, and economic differences between groups of people. So an example of this would be the border between China and Vietnam, which came about after a lot of adjustment between cultures. And a subsequent boundary doesn't just have to be like between whole countries. It can also be between like within a city when you can see differences between like the lower class groups and the upper class groups, and that creates kind of an ethnographic boundary, even though it might not be like a politically defined boundary. A relic boundary is a boundary that's used to exist and still can be detected on the landscape. And an example of this is the Berlin Wall between East and West Germany. Now Germany is obviously just one country, but there's still pieces of the Berlin Wall that still remain. Can anyone give me another example of a relic boundary that you might see in Asia? And just say it in the chat. Yes, Marcus, good job. So the Great Wall of China was actually a relic boundary. You can still see it today, obviously, when you like go to China. And it was originally made to defend against like invaders and stuff. So yes, it was a boundary. A superimposed boundary was a boundary imposed onto people or forced onto people by outside powers. And the biggest example of this is just a bunch of countries in Africa. So many boundaries in Africa are actually superimposed because of the event in history called the Scramble of Africa, which happened in like the 1900s. And this was a period of time where a bunch of European states such as Belgium and the UK took over large parts of Africa and divided them up however they wanted to. And what this did was that they completely ignored the existing cultural groups and they made their own boundaries. So new cultural groups were now next to each other and part of the same state. That caused a lot of conflict, and that conflict can still be seen today. A militarized boundary is a boundary that is heavily guarded and very hard to pass through. And a main example of this would just be the boundary between North and South Korea. And there's like a huge wall, there's a bunch of guards, and you literally cannot pass through it. And there's this zone in the middle called the DMZ, or the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. And lastly, an open boundary is a boundary where crossing can be done freely. So an example of this would be the countries that signed the Schengen Agreement in Europe, and all of these countries now, like the people can pass freely through them, and as well as goods and services, they can, like without borders technically, and they can pass through these European countries freely. So obviously, as you can see from these definitions, boundaries can have both positive and negative side effects. So one of these positive side effects, like as you can see in history, the European Union fostered the free flow of goods and people between member countries, and this grew their economic strength because they functioned as a whole group and they traded and they had a common currency, and that just all of these like open boundaries between these countries just promoted their growth and success in the global economy. A negative effect would be North and South Korea, which are completely blocked out from each other through their militarized boundary. and they have completely opposite environments. So South Korea has a lot of cultural diversity, bustling cities, like amazing economy, and a great position in the global economy. On the other hand, North Korea, a lot of people are in poverty. They're brainwashed by their government, and their dictator is very strict, and they have to follow strict rules, and they live very like isolated lives from the rest of the world. So this is an example of how a boundary can negatively impact people. And obviously, boundaries can be fought over. So a summary of all of this is that land and maritime boundaries, as well as international agreements, can both influence national or regional identity and either encourage or discourage international or internal interactions such as trade and disputes over resources. So I see, Marcus, you ask that the heartland touches the coast. So what he was trying to say was that like the heartland was just like the central area, and the coastline on the north, no one could really enter from there at that time because like it was really icy and cold. So he didn't really count that as a coastline. He mostly counted it as like a central area. But yes, it does touch the coast. Okay, next, the functions of boundaries. So first, a boundary can be defined. So this is when a legal document divides two entities, sorry. So this can be anything from like a peace treaty that says to stop fighting over a boundary line to anything like your property papers that say that like this area of land is mine. So a delimited boundary is when a boundary line is drawn on a map. So as you can see in this picture on the right, this is just like a random like image of a bunch of countries and lines drawn between them, and that's just a delimited boundary. It's just drawn on a map and recognized by cartographers. A demarcated boundary is when physical objects identify the boundary line. So as you can see on the left, there's a fence separating these two countries, and demarcated boundaries can be fences or walls such as the one in the picture, but it can also be just a sign like saying "Welcome to Ohio" or something like that. So this is called the Law of the Sea, and this was established by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. And basically what this law or agreement did was that it addressed issues that existed because of water boundaries. And these issues related to like fishing, trade, resource extraction, and immigration. And there's 4 zones that are covered in the Law of the Sea. So the first one is the territorial sea, and it is 12 nautical miles from the coast out into the water where the country has full control. So they can kick out whatever ships they need to. They like completely control everything, like what goes in and out, and they have full power. The next zone is the contiguous zone, and this is up to 24 nautical miles. And so like from 12 to 24 nautical miles, they have this limited control. And this includes customs, immigration, and sanitation. So they can control like if people are illegally coming into the country through boats or something, or if people are littering in that area. After that is the exclusive economic zone, or the EEZ, and this is from 24 miles up to 200 nautical miles, where ships from that country can explore and extract resources. So they can go out into those waters and fish and mine for oil and mine for minerals. And past that is like the high seas. So like and this is past 200 nautical miles, and these are open waters for all states to access. So like the middle of the Pacific Ocean, like that's basically high seas for everyone. For internal boundaries, on the AP exam, you're mostly only going to need to know like internal boundaries relating to the US and other representative democracies. So for an electorate, this is basically a group of elected officials which define voting districts. So this would be like your government representatives and that control how voting district lines are drawn. Next, a census. This is a nationwide survey or count of the population every 10 years to ensure that the districts and representatives are correct. So the census basically counts everyone and makes sure that all the districts are equal and fair. Reapportionment is when the amount of representatives given to each state based on population is adjusted. So let's say a bunch of people randomly moved out of California, like half the population. After reapportionment, California would now have half of the representatives that they used to, because it's only fair that since they have less people, they have less representation. And this is for the House of Representatives. And redistricting is similar to reapportionment, but this is relating to voting districts. And this is when boundaries are redrawn to make them have about the same amount of people. So like a state is divided into X number of voting districts, and this ensures that there's like an equal amount of people in each voting district so that you can get the most accurate vote from the people. And gerrymandering, and this is when voting district boundaries are drawn, so like redistricting happens in order to obtain an advantage in the elections. And this term came about when Governor Jerry from Massachusetts influenced how boundaries were drawn, and he basically went to the people who drew the voting districts, and he said that like he made them in his favor. Yes, Marcus, you're right. That's good. That's a good definition of it. Um, and the term gerrymandering came about because a news editor noticed that one of his weirdly shaped districts looked like a salamander. So Jerry plus salamander made gerrymandering, and it's obviously illegal now. And you can see an example of gerrymandering in this diagram on the right. So on the middle diagram, you can see how if the districts were divided evenly and like normally shaped, blue wins by a majority just because of like how many people are voting for blue. But in the very right, you can see when gerrymandering happens, all of these weirdly shaped districts are strategically drawn to make sure that red wins, even though red doesn't have a majority in the voting polls. And obviously, it's illegal now, and all of these things, like all of these vocabulary terms, affect election results. So for types of government, you won't have to know too much in depth about the various forms of government for AP Human Geography. Like you won't have to know like a dictatorship or like a monarchy or anything like really in depth. You just need to know the difference between a federal system and a unitary system. So for a federal system, power is dispersed between central governments and local and states governments. And powers are spread between the different levels of government. So as you can see in the United States, the national government has a role, as well as the state government has the power to make its own laws, and the local government also manages the cities and has its own laws as well. And types of countries with a federal system mostly include countries with a variety of cultures and ethnic groups with a lot of minorities. So of course, the United States, it's called the mixing pot. It has so many different ethnic groups that need to be like acknowledged and like cared for, and this can be done with the federal system. And some examples of these are, of course, the United States, Canada, Russia, Belgium, Nigeria, Australia, and Germany. So most of like the bigger world powers and like larger countries and like more developed countries usually have a federal system. For a unitary system, there is a strong and powerful central government with less influential or just completely no local governments. And usually there's no levels of power because the central government is very, very dominant. Unitary governments aren't necessarily dictatorships. I just like to remind you that. They can also be democratic, but just have like a really powerful central government. Like France, they have a very strong like central government, but they also like care for what their population says. They're just considered unitary because of their central government. And the types of countries with this system are countries that have few cultural and ethnic groups and few very small minorities. And examples of unitary systems are France, of course, Japan, Egypt, Spain, China, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, to name a few. Does anyone have any questions so far? Feel free to ask anything. Okay, great, I'll move on. So state morphology, this sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. This is just what a shape's state is. Sorry, a state's shape is. So like, it's shaped like a blob or like an elongated section. And this state morphology affects how people feel and how they interact with others. So examples of this include like getting goods and services. So if people live like very far from their government, they may find it harder to receive the same amount of like services and goods that people living closer to the central government can. And they may also feel underrepresented in their government and feel isolated. And instead they may identify with states that are closer to them than they are with the country that they live in. And since they feel so isolated and like distant from their central government, they may start demanding control over their resources. Like, let's say people living in a rural area in country A, they may start being like, oh, the government has no role here, so we should own all of our land, and the government shouldn't, and we should own all of the fish in the water and whatnot. The first type of state shape is an elongated state, and the most common example that you will see is Chile. Obviously, it's like a very long, it's like not even a rectangle, it's just a very long strip of land. And what happens in an elongated state is that there's isolation at the edges and there's problems regarding communication, travel, governance, and defense. So when you're living in the center, you are more close to like all parts. But when you're living at the edges, it's hard to communicate with the rest of the country and travel to the other side of the country. It becomes really hard. And the central government has less power as you get farther and farther along, like towards the edges. And since it has like really long borders, like it has one really long land border and one really long sea border, it becomes hard to defend in case they face an enemy. On the other hand of the spectrum, there's a compact state. So this is Zimbabwe, and a compact state is a lot more efficient in communication, travel, governance, and defense because there's less distance from the center to the outside edge, and it's more like circular shaped. So everything's like all compacted into one, like it's easier to make everything run smoothly and like establish infrastructure and do all of that. A prorupted state is a state with an extension or a proruption, and what happens is that this proruption usually feels detached and it's hard to access, and they might identify with states that are closer around them. So in this picture, you can see the country India, and this proruption, which is this like piece of land that's on the right side, is connected to the mainland by this very narrow strip of land. So it's harder to get to that side of India, and they may identify closer with the countries that are around them, such as Myanmar, Bangladesh, and China, rather than with India, because they feel like a lot more distant from the mainland. A perforated state is when a state completely surrounds another state. So this is South Africa. This was the most common example that you will see on the AP exam. And South Africa completely surrounds Lesotho. It doesn't completely surround Swaziland, as most people get confused with, because Swaziland actually shares a border with Mozambique, but Lesotho is completely surrounded. And Lesotho completely depends on South Africa for trade and travel because everything has to go through South Africa. Like all the goods and services going out or in of the country, as well as the people traveling in and out, have to go through the country. What people usually get confused on is that the perforated state is actually the state that is surrounding, and the surrounded state is the one, in this case, it would be Lesotho, so it's surrounded by the perforated state. So just keep that in mind. Lastly, there's a fragmented state. So this is pretty self-explanatory. Like all of the land is like broken up, and communication, governance, and travel also becomes hard here because everything you have to travel over water. And even though there's a central government on a main island, it's harder to get out the same message along to those pieces of land for the rest of the country. And in this example, it shows the Philippines, which is just composed of a bunch of islands that are just like floating in the water. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, great. Oh, yeah, there's no like technical term for a surrounded state that you like need to know for the AP exam. If you ever need to like refer to it, just call it a surrounded state. So, yeah. Oh, Kayla, the compacted state things. Wait, I'll go back to that slide. So this is like a lot more efficient in like communication, travel, governance, and defense than a elongated state because it's like more circular and everything's like closer to the center. So like elongated and compact states are like complete opposites. Okay, great. So now we're going to be doing multiple choice questions. So the first one is going to be on state morphology. This should be pretty easy because we just covered it. So based on the map given, what state morphology does Indonesia best fit with? Elongated, compact, perforated, fragmented, or prorupted? And you can just type your answer in the chat box. Great. Good job, guys. I see a bunch of fragmented, and that is the correct answer. Good job. So next, boundary types. The 49th parallel dividing the United States and Canada is an example of which of the following types of boundaries? A, a relic boundary, B, an antecedent boundary, C, a subsequent boundary, D, a superimposed boundary, and E, an open boundary. Okay, I'm seeing B's, a C, and a D. Okay, so it's actually B, and it's an antecedent boundary because it followed the latitude, the 49th latitude line, and it wasn't made for any particular reason. It just was made to make a boundary, and Canada and the United States evolved separately after the boundary line was made. Was this before the Oregon colony? I believe it was. I would actually search that up because I'm not too sure about that. But yeah, this is just like a boundary that was made not for any particular reason. It was just like it happened, and then Canada and the United States developed separately. Okay, now governance. Country X has a central government as well as 30 other provinces with their own government, each of which have power over their own laws and residents. Which type of government best describes Country X? A, municipal, B, confederate, C, autocratic, D, unitary, and E, federal. Oh, wow, there's a lot of E's. Okay, good job. It is federal. Okay, now we're going to be doing our FRQ on governance. So I'm going to split. Oh, sorry, Marcus, did you have a question? Okay, so how do you define? Okay, so I'm just going to, oh, confederate. Okay. Those were kind of just like filler answers to like mess up like the answer choices, you know, like to trip you up. But what you really need to know is federal and unitary. And that's what you're going to be tested on most of the time. Okay, so the FRQ on governance. So I'm going to be splitting these up more separate than A, B, and C, and D. Oh, unitary is when there's like a strong central government, basically. So political geographers classify most countries as either federal states or unitary states. So these states are Germany and Japan. So first in the chat box, you can define unitary states and then identify the country shown that fits the definition of a unitary state. Okay, thank you, Marcus. So what he said was that a unitary state has a strong central government. And does anyone know which state, like of Germany and Japan, like between the two, is unitary? Okay, Japan and no local government power. Great. Part B, explain one positive and one negative impact of a unitary system. So you can just, for now, just write you don't have to explain, just like list one positive impact in the chat box. Okay, great. Now one negative impact. Okay, good job, guys. Yeah, those are all great answers. And I'll actually be going over like the College Board rubric at the end, just to like go over, and I'll explain how they like graded all of this and like how to go through the process of writing this. And for part C, identify and explain. So in this case, just don't explain, just identify a reason why some countries are governed as federal states. So why would someone want to establish a federal system in their country? Okay, good job, guys. So I'm going to be going over the College Board rubric for this. Do you guys want me to put the link in the chat so you can follow along? So this is question 3 from the 2017 AP Human Geography like FRQ section, just for reference. So part A, the definition of a unitary state according to College Board is a country organized in such a way that most power is placed in the central government and there is limited political power at subnational scales of governance, which you guys said that there is a strong central government and there's barely any power in local governments, and that's you'd get the full points for that, and you identified Japan correctly. So, one positive and one negative impact of a unitary system. So they've listed a bunch of impacts here. So I'll be going through the positive impacts first. So one of them is the standardization of laws and their implementation across the country. So everyone in the country would follow the same laws, because like the same exact laws, because there's no state governments to make their own, which I think someone said. Yeah, that unitary system can unify people more. And another positive impact is patriotism or pride in one's country is bolstered due to uniformity. So if everyone follows the same set of rules and everyone is under the same government, they may feel more connected to their central government, because there's no local governments or state governments that are like kind of like in the way of their connection with the central government. And efficiencies are also achieved through less duplication or faster countrywide implementation of laws. So since the central government makes all of the laws and like services and government services, there's no like problems with like slowing down at the state government and local government levels. Like everything is just implemented all across the country. I mean, that's what's supposed to happen. There are also fewer government or taxation agencies, and there's fewer scales of government or taxation. So when there's just one central government, there's not going to be, you're not going to have to pay like state income tax. You're just going to have to pay like one tax to the government. So you're not going to have that many like taxation agencies. Oh, and Marcus, you said patriotism or nationalism. So this is talking about patriotism, just like a pride in your country, not like an over exaggerated amount of pride. So like nationalism. They're just talking about like normal patriotism. And another positive impact is the potential for corruption of local government reduced. So local government elections are usually less controlled and monitored than like national or federal government like elections. So this corruption at a local level is obviously going to be reduced if there's just one central government and people are just voting for the same people like at once. And lastly, the creation of a national identity that reduces the potential for devolutionary processes. So I know we haven't covered devolution yet. That's coming up in some of the upcoming streams, but that basically means anything that like tears a country apart, kind of. So since everyone's under the same central government, they're going to feel less like divided and they're less likely to like split apart. Yes, the opposite of evolution. That's a good way to think of it. Now onto the negative impacts. So what happens with a unitary system is that a centralization of power can lead to a disconnect with local areas, minority groups, regional political parties, or disparate regions. So as we covered in like one of the table slide, we said that states with unitary systems usually had like less minority groups and like less diversity. So when there's just like that one government, they're gonna focus on the main like majority groups, and they're just gonna ignore all the people living in like rural areas and like minorities and stuff. And you can see this in China, like the Chinese government usually focuses on like Beijing and all of their like bustling like cities, and the people in the rural areas, like the farmers, they mostly like live their own like little lives, and the government isn't like doesn't play that much of a role there. Another negative impact is the marginalization of local cultures. So this is basically the same as the first one. So local cultures are just kind of like shoved aside, and there's more like standardization at a country level. So like everyone is kind of like pressured into following the same like culture and like standard of like living and stuff. Oh yes, Hong Kong, that's a great example. Next, a central government may not effectively provide services on a subnational scale. Since there's no state or local governments to manage their own state and city, the central government has to take care of everything. So they may not be able to look at who's receiving which services and like fix that. Decisions and policies of the central government could become dominated by the interests of the politically or culturally dominant group. So this kind of relates to the marginalization of local cultures. So when there's that like one like dominant, or like there's those few dominant groups, the government is just going to focus on those, and everything is centered around them. And the indigenous, rural, and like minority groups are just going to be like shoved aside. They're not going to be acknowledged. They're going to be ignored, and like any policies, they're not going to take into account their feelings and rights. And lastly, the central government is bogged down by competing local problems, and they will be slow to respond to local issues. Since the central government has to kind of take care of everything because of like the lack of local governments or subnational governments, they're going to be overwhelmed by the amount of things they have to take care of. So let's say the wildfires in California. So what happens is that the state government and the states surrounding California, they will all work to target their attention at that issue. But our national government can still focus on like how the nation as a whole is moving forward. But in a central government, the whole nation's like attention will be completely diverted towards that wildfire, like in a unitary system. And nothing else would happen, and this would make them slow to respond to any like local issues, because they'll be so like focused on like the huge issues that they can't pinpoint smaller issues that subnational and like state and local governments can. Like if a central government received an issue about like a park, they wouldn't care about that. But in a federal system, like a local government could address that issue about the park. Lastly, part C. So some reasons why some countries are governed as federal states. So one of the reasons is that there are multiple nationalities, ethnicities, or cultures in that country. So diverse states, politically, economically, regionally, and culturally, devolve power in order to reduce separatist tendencies or to enhance loyalty to the country. So the word devolve just means that like they split up the power and like diffuse it through the levels of government, and this decreases the chance of everyone separating because of all of their differences. Another reason is to address devolutionary forces. So federal governments are able to maintain national cohesion by bridging physical or cultural barriers and providing means for resolving conflicts between subnational areas. So if there was a conflict between two states or like two cultures within a city, the subnational governments could take care of that, as like in contrast to the central government not being able to care for that as much because they have like a lot bigger issues to focus on. And lastly, larger countries will like exude territorial control over large or fragmented areas. So large countries devolve power to subnational units in order to maintain legitimacy with local citizens or allow subnational units to more effectively provide governmental services or address local issues. So, as we said before, like these larger countries, they're more likely to have a federal system because they need all of these state governments and local governments to manage all of the different nuances that have to do with government and everyday life and like just managing society. So these subnational governments are very important. Like one central government can't take care of everything in these large countries or like fragmented countries. And as distance increases from a national capital, people tend to feel better served by decision makers who are closer to home. Like again with California, like you feel more comfortable going to the California state capital and like talking about your issues than you feel going all the way across the country to Washington D.C. if that was a central government and like talking about your issues there because you feel more safe and like understood because all of Californians kind of have like a similar culture, so you feel more comfortable to talk there and like be served there. So that is the FRQ. Balance of power. Okay, so the College Board, they have their specific like rubrics that have like specific things that they grade on. Um, I think the balance of power isn't on there because that's what they meant by like the corruption, I believe. In part B, we talked about how like corruption could happen in the local governments. But if you explain your answer enough in an FRQ, it doesn't necessarily have to be on the rubric. So just remember that. So that's it for today. Does anyone have any questions? And you can also use the ask a question feature at the bottom if you want to ask an anonymous question. Um, Thank you guys so much for tuning in. You guys did great on the multiple choice questions and the FRQ. Thank you for being such a great audience. Bye.